Parable of the prodigal son.
Parable of the prodigal and his brother.
Parable of the prodigal and his brother.
The lost son.
The lost son. Okay. All of these are, I'm going to suggest, steering us in the wrong direction. Is the story actually about the sons? It's about the father, yes. And we don't even have to say about the father. We could say it's about the parent. Could we not? All right. I mean, just trying to be as inclusive as we could. We're not being unfaithful to the text when we say it that way. It's a parent struggling to hang on to recover, to be an influence in the lives of, some nasty offspring. All right. So, we want to rethink the title. It is traditional, but it skews our attention. It skews us. It drives us in a particular direction. I would like to suggest, as a general rule, set all of the titles aside and read things for what they are in the context in which they are, if that makes sense. Okay. So, here's a good masculine story, and the men, of course, are screwing up. All right. Luke 15:10. In just the same way, I tell you, there will be rejoicing among the angels of God over one sinner who repents. So this is in the context of the lost sheep, the lost coin, Jesus sitting down with people who are sinners, being confronted about that, and pursuit. Okay? There will be rejoicing among the angels of God over one sinner who repents. Then he said, a man had 2 sons, and the younger son said to his father, Father, give me the share of your estate that should come to me. Now, my dad is dead. My mom's alive. She's 86. She has a fairly sizable estate, but I'm one of 9 kids, all of whom are alive. I'm not expecting very much. Could you imagine me going to my mom and saying, give it to me now? Could you imagine? It's a bit appalling, isn't it? It has the odor of, Dad, you haven't had the courtesy to drop dead for me. And it has that odor. There's something, I value your possessions more than you. And with the way he's going to deal with possessions, he doesn't value the possessions very much either. He's going to waste them. And yet he values them more than he values his dad. It's an ugly, 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 ugly moment. Yes?
With rich people in America, you have things like trusts. Would that sort of thing be there that, I can imagine a rich kid today saying, where's my share? Early, because you're going to get it after. Would that concept have been there at all? The idea of getting that you have right to an inheritance early?
No.
Okay.
The presumption is you have no right to it at all. Until the father says it's yours, or dies. And they would have very carefully crafted wills. And the presumption was not quite primogeniture, the first son gets it all, but it leaned in that direction, because if you split your wealth up in a lot of different ways, what became of it? It dissipated. So it was their inclination to try to hold it together as much as possible. And at a certain point, you were no longer an heir. Because it created too much dispersion. So older sons tended to get the better deal. Younger sons tended to get cared for. If they had a lot of children, they began to create problems for those children because those children would not be part of the cut. So there were a lot of things that were going on in terms of people's consciousness of this thing. But the property was absolutely, definitively the father's. Okay? You had no right to it. What this son did here would have been, the story would have been a bit appalling to the crew that read it for the first time. As it should be for us. The thought of me going to my 86-year-old mom and saying, I want my ninth now. All right. Now, the business of going off to a foreign land in a Jewish context, and I'm always uncertain about how close Luke is to the Jewish context. Israel was always a hard land to live in. It was a lot like California is now. Okay? It had one river, dependent on rainfall. They get a lot of rainfall in Palestine, up towards the north, in Galilee. They get as much rain, curiously, as England does, but they get it all in a very short period. Okay? And that's the, how many seasons does California have? It doesn't have 4. Well, it actually has 2. It has the short, cool, wet, and the long, warm, dry. Okay, we have 9 months without rain as a very normal thing. We get, in a good year, we get 17 inches of rain. In this bad last year, we had 11. In the year before that, we had 3. I mean, so we struggles. Same thing with Israel. They would have periodic droughts, and their droughts could go up to 40 and 50 years. It's why there are so many Jews living in Alexandria. There are more Jews living in Alexandria than there are in Israel. They've got 1 million Jews there. We don't think there are 1 million. There are 5 million Jews scattered throughout the entire world. Jerusalem had 80,000 Jews. Rome had 50. Okay? So it would get dry and people would take to the hills, and typically they would go to a place where there was water. So there's a significant number of Jews in Babylon, a significant number of Jews down by the Nile River, because you got to survive. So the idea of sons going off to other places would not have been unusual. Okay, so the father divided the property between them. After a few days, the younger son collected all his belongings and set off to a distant country where he squandered his inheritance on a life of dissipation. When he had freely spent everything, a severe famine struck that country and he found himself in dire need. So he hired himself out to one of the local citizens who sent him to his farm to tend the swine. And Luke does this deliberately. Jesus does this deliberately. So not only has he lost his father and his homeland and his inheritance, he's lost his faith. He's feeding pigs. He's lost everything. We have reached destitution. And you know that whole thing about people who got problems with life, they need to be hit really, really hard, to begin that process of crawling back up. Well, he's been hit really, really hard. And he longed to eat his fill of the pods on which the swine fed, but nobody gave him any. So when we get to the point in the story where the father said, "My son was dead," it's not a far stretch from where he actually is it? I mean, he's not exaggerating a lot. It's a slight exaggeration. All right? Coming to his senses, he thought, "How many of my father's hired workers have more than enough food to eat, but here I am dying from hunger." What do you think of his motive? It hasn't changed. I used my dad then, I'm going to use him now. He's still using. This kid is consistent. Okay? How many of my father's hired workers have more than enough food to eat, but here I am dying from hunger? I shall get up and go to my father, and I shall say to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son. Treat me as you would one of your hired workers." Everything he says there is true. Everything he says there is true. What does he leave out?
I'm sorry.
Yes. Yes, he leaves out, "I am sorry." Now this story is very carefully constructed. Very carefully constructed to describe the very lowest form of repentance. This is not an accident of the story. It is deliberate. We cannot miss it. This boy is self-serving. And his repentance, if you could call it that, is self-serving. All right? The story doesn't step back from it. Doesn't apologize for it, just lays it out there for us to marvel at. So, he got up and went back to his father. While he was still a long way off, his father caught sight of him, spat on the ground, and said, "Don't let that boy anywhere near you." Oops. Oops. His father caught sight of him and was filled with compassion. He ran to his son, embraced him, and kissed him. Parents, do you love your children when they're really, really bad? Yes, you do. Yeah, so we understand. Yes. And our kids every now and then disappoint us in stunning ways that leave us flabbergasted, and yet we still love them. So. Now, he's going to start his little rehearsed line. He's going to start it. He's going to get interrupted. The father really is not interested. His son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son." What he's supposed to say next is, "Treat me as one of your hired workers." Father cuts him off. His father ordered the servants, "Quickly, bring the finest robe and put it on. Put a ring on his finger, the ring, symbol of authority, and sandals on his feet." The servants went barefoot. The member of the household wore shoes. "Take the fattened calf, slaughter it. Let us celebrate with a feast, because this son of mine was dead." He's heading that way. This son of mine was dead and has come back to life again. He was lost and has been found. Not fixed. Do you think this is the last trouble this man's going to have with this kid? I don't. I think I have mothers who come to me for counseling about their kids, and they're in their 80s, and their kids are in their 50s. And are the moms still worried about those 50-year-old kids? Oh, yeah. Mothers never get to take their loads off. Do dads? Dads are quieter about it. They don't come to talk to me. I think they suffer just as much, but they don't talk to me about it. All right. All of the father's behavior, the weight was significance. The fine robe, the ring, signs of wealth, signs of authority, in particular the ring. The son had intended to come back as a servant. The father doesn't want anything to do with it. So the father granted his request for a share of his property ahead of time, but refuses to accept the alteration in the relationship. "You're not my worker, you're my son." So he refuses him this. Finally, the father refuses him. Okay? The celebration began. Verse 25. Now the older son had been out in the field, and on his way back, as he neared the house. So this is the good son, right? He's working. He's taking care of things. He said to his father in reply, I skipped. He heard the sound of music and dancing. He called one of the servants and asked what this might mean. So, this is a son with authority. He can summon servants. The father summons servants. This son summons servants also. He summoned a substance in this household. The servant said to him, "Your brother," the servant gets it, "your brother has returned, and your father has slaughtered the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound." He became angry. And when he refused to enter the house, his father came out and pleaded with him. All right. So, in the first case, he sees the one son at a distance.